Hey everyone, this is Nick from Tenacity.ai with my co-host Jason, and you're listening to the Cloud Cost Optimization Podcast. Today we're going to talk about implementing, FinOps as a discipline, cloud cost optimization strategies early on in your journey, specifically, at migration, and what that means from a, digital transformation perspective. We're not specifically talking about, greenfield initiatives, which we will talk about later, but that's oftentimes an entry point for organizations, but usually in the startup phase there. Most organizations that we've experienced, especially large organizations, go through a migration phase where they're taking a large workload and they have a strategy to move it out of the data center and move it into public cloud. It's especially a topic now because of rising energy costs, because we're seeing inflation hit the data center space and force organizations rethink their cloud or cloud avoidance, cloud strategy, cloud adoption strategy, in basically what's going on inside of our global economy. So, Jason, I guess first question out the gate is, when is the right time to implement a FinOps discipline when thinking about transitioning to public cloud, moving out of the data center?
Is this a trick question?
Yeah. Well, for you it is.
At time of migration would be the right answer to that. I'll take
As
at
soon as
time
possible,
of migration
right?
For 200, Alex.
Right.
Yeah, at time of migration. I mean, it's always best to set any of these principles, go up front, right? There's it's much harder it's much harder and it never gets done. I mean, let's just be honest. You and I have been involved in many of these before, right? You always talk about what you're going to do after something. Like, oh, no, we'll come back and do that. We'll do that later. We'll go back and go behind and do all that stuff. No. I mean, the amount of time spent up front to ensure that you're governing your cloud environment correctly, especially if you can start from a vanilla or blank slate, so to speak. It's taking the extra time to do that up front saves an exponential amount of time on the back end. Again, not very quantifiable, right? It's hard to quantify what I've lost by doing this, but it with experience, I think you'd be hard to find any technologist with experience that wouldn't agree with that statement.
Well, I think there's three things to there's more than three things, but there's a couple of things that just hit my mind right now on what to think about. The number one thing is that an organization that's going from the data center to public cloud is going from probably thinking in terms of capital expenditure around their equipment and around their data center costs. The data center costs are probably fairly smooth. They're not too variable. The power might be variable, but it's going to be a fairly well understood, fairly comfortable model, especially from the financial side. And then they're going to move to this 100% variable spending model. And not only that, this variable spending model can be impacted by developers and what technologists do. And depending on how big the organization is and how many changes are happening, this variable model can suddenly become really, really scary to someone in the financial space when they start getting those first bills, and there is not consistency to what's going on. Certainly not during the migration, but especially post-migration when this big, scary number starts to appear every month, and you're having to reconcile that against budgets, right? Against where does this spending go? It's a very different model than kind of the capital, we're going to think 5 years ahead. I buy this hardware for this department and I buy this other stuff for this other department, and they use X amount of U in power inside of a data center, so I'm going to split that and share that off to this other organization. It is not that simple inside of cloud. And I'm not saying that to scare folks. You should absolutely move to public cloud. There's superpowers there. But the things you need to think about, like out the gate, as a technology person, I want to get FinOps discipline in place so that I don't spook my CFO. And as a CFO, I want to get that FinOps methodology in place so I can get reporting right away during the migration, so I can see early problems immediately. Like if I've moved 1/10 of the workload and it's 4 times the cost I expect it to be, I want to know that immediately.
Immediately.
Very soon when that happens. Yeah. So I can start taking action on it, because there's tons of things you can do, but if you don't have that knowledge, you don't have that transparency, well, then you're stuck. So, that's first is, want to get the financial, want to get the finance organization in the right place, because it's a variable spending model. The second thing is like, organizations, when you do a big purchase, do a capital purchase, you're actually thinking kind of about your discount programs and so on up front. Like, hey, I'm going to make a several $1,000,000 purchase and I expect to get 70% off of this hardware. Well, that doesn't work that way in public cloud. Public cloud, it's very much commitment based. And so, Jason, you've definitely been a buyer for a long time. This to technology folks, to financial folks, this is a completely different paradigm. And thinking in terms of commitment can be kind of scary to them. So I think that's an area we could dive into, and we certainly dive into in other podcast episodes. Getting your arms around it. And I think kind of the third, and this is the operational piece, is actually understanding what's moving in the cloud, right? So that as you move out of the data center, sometimes it doesn't translate into the cloud very well. And we've seen this a number of times. Large database servers, like the classic example, like you had bought this hardware, it runs it, you move it to cloud, and suddenly it's this really expensive hit. It's like a black hole for money in the cloud. And getting your arms around what those are and what those first things that need to refactor, I think is really, really important.
I completely agree. I mean, listen, I think in general, I'm going to summarize this. What you're talking about is visibility, I think, into how are the decisions I'm making right now going to affect my costs, which you need to know. And unfortunately, it's really it is difficult to understand true cost by resource, or down to the individual widget perspective if you're internal, right? And that's always been really difficult. It's not in the cloud. And so sometimes when we're doing a migration, we see costs of the cloud, and it's, we go, oh my gosh, that's how much that one resource costs me, right? Well, it's not that resource is more expensive. It's just now you had no idea what that resource cost you when it was sitting on a server, unless you bought individual servers for everything, right? But that's just a completely, nobody's been doing that for years. So having the visibility into what this is going to cost you, not only what's it going to cost you, but also how will I be able to modernize or optimize or whatever the thing that you end up planning on doing, how will that affect my costs? Because you could take an application that's being run in some legacy way and not just optimize it. You can just optimize it, right? Save 30, 40, 50%, especially if you let us help you. Or you might take it and completely refactor it or modernize it. And then you're talking about a completely different cost model that could be half the price. I mean, you just don't know until you have the visibility into these things to understand what my workload spikes are. Is this fit for a function? Is this fit for containers? Whatever the case may be. But knowing this and getting it to a place in which you can easily test these things is, one, the only way you're going to realize these savings. But without the visibility piece that you mentioned into the decisions you're making during the migration, I don't think it's going to be very difficult.
I think so. I think, the ultimate goal is always to get to that refactor space, right? Because the power of cloud, it puts at the fingertips of organizations hundreds of tools that sometimes they haven't had access to, and sometimes that's because of the economics of getting access to it, right? That it may cost millions of dollars to acquire technology, or maybe even just hundreds of thousands of dollars can still be prohibitive, right? To acquire technology to try something else, but when you get to public cloud and you can now buy it, at this SIP level and test it and it will cost you dollars to figure out if this is going to work for you, and it may potentially save you millions of dollars. But before, you had to make this huge upfront investment, and you had to believe somebody telling you it was going to save your business. It was going to be the panacea for you. In 9 times out of 10, those promises were never fulfilled after the massive purchase, the massive negotiation, the massive purchase, and the 6 to 12 month implementation timeline.
Or even worse, remember that agreement we had to sign to test POC Avamar, where it was like we had to figure out what metrics of deduplication were going to be what we ended in, and then they had to ship us $1 million worth of equipment. We had to set it all up, and it's like, man, by that point, it's like, oh, well, we're keeping it, right? The power of being able to just immediately snap your fingers, oh, I want to test out this new backup solution, is equating it to that, and not having to spend. We spent months negotiating that POC thing. It was so stupid, and now you can. So the power's there. You got to get it there. You just got to make sure that you understand what you need to be, what visibility you need into your usage and spend, so that you can make the correct decisions. And you can't do that without thinking about these things up front. And so that's the most important thing there.
I agree. I mean, if you want to fall victim to the sunk cost fallacy, sign a big agreement up front. It's really hard to have spent $1 million and go, wait a minute, this is junk, I got to get rid of it. It's really hard to do that. It's really easy to do that when you say, like, I'm going to test this piece of code against something that's going to cost me tens of dollars, and when it doesn't work out, you can go, oh well. Even if it's hundreds of dollars, even if it's thousands of dollars, you can throw it away. And we do this all the time. We test things out. Is Elasticsearch the right thing to use for this? And then find out, like, no, it's not. It's or DynamoDB, right? Turns out it wasn't the right thing to use for certain use cases, but we got to test it without having to do some massive implementation. It cost us tens of bucks to go do the test, understand, and then move on. So I think, I think it's important for organizations to wrap their head around sort of all the changes that are going to happen. And the way to do that is to implement a FinOps discipline very early on. And this doesn't have to be overly complicated. What you need is the engineering and financial people at the table. In the same way that DevOps brought developers and operations folks together to think about technology differently, the same is true here. Is bringing FinOps and engineers, or financial people and engineers to the table, is how you're going to implement your FinOps organization and really start to get your hands around the superpower of cloud and how you can optimize it to actually, lower those costs, not fall victim to these really, to paying MSRP. What would be the equivalent of if you were buying it up front, not getting the discount levels, not getting the optimization that you would try to figure out ahead of time.
Yep, I agree.
Cool. All right. Well, I think that's probably it for that topic. I'm sure we're going to touch on this quite a bit more because this is a big topic. When do you implement your FinOps discipline, and how do you do so? So why don't we touch on more of that in a future episode? To our listeners, thanks for tuning in. Tune in next time for more of these topics on the Cloud Cost Optimization podcast.